There is a version of this story that the court of Devon Ardwell prefers to tell. In that version, the bond was simply lost, a tragedy of timing, a promised mate taken by fever before she could be claimed, a king who grieved in silence for 2 years and moved on. In that version, no one was complicit. No one was used. No girl stood in a great hall and delivered a lie she believed was the truth, while the man she faced felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The court prefers that version because the other one requires accounting, and accounting for what was done to the pack archivist's daughter requires admitting that the most powerful keep in the North ran on cruelty aimed at a girl who had never, in her 22 years, been named worth protecting. This is the other version. The winter of the 300th year of the Ardwell line was the coldest in living memory, and Seren knew it not because the frost climbed higher on the archive windows than she could reach, or because the cook fires burned all night, but because the ink in her smallest stone jar had gone thick and refused to flow. She had been heating it with the heel of her palm for 3 weeks by then, pressing warmth into the clay until her skin reddened and the ink loosened enough to write. She was used to making something useful out of very little. She had been doing it since she was 16, since the day the old Alpha's announcement had come down through the pack ranks like a stone dropped into still water. The healer's daughter was to be removed from the rolls. Her name struck. Her mother's work expunged. Seren had not wept. She had packed the remaining records into oilskin and carried them to the back of the cold archive room, and she had kept working, because there was no other plan available to her. If you leave the ink, it goes solid. You cannot leave the ink. She was at her table in the archive corridor, one hand spread flat over the small jar, when Orlin's runner appeared in the doorway. The runner was a thin boy who never looked at her directly and had learned, Seren thought, that lesson early. Looking at a person without a name on the rolls was an acknowledgement that they existed, and in a pack that ran on rank, acknowledgement was a political act. The boy held out the folded message without meeting her eyes. She read it. She read it again. Steward Orlin required the archive rat. That was his word for her. And she had decided years ago not to spend any feeling on it, to carry a document to the King's Hall before the midday bell. A formal communique from the steward's office to the king. A delicate matter, the note said. One requiring a trusted hand. She was not trusted. She understood that. She was useful, which Orlin treated as the same thing, and she was discardable, which was the actual reason he sent her on the errands that required someone expendable. She wrapped her hands in their usual cloth against the cold. She had developed a habit of wrapping her hands. She had told herself it was against the frost, and it was partly true, and she took the sealed document and walked through the inner yard toward the king's hall. Marta was at the kitchen door when she passed, transferring bread loaves from the night's baking. The old cook paused and looked at her the way she always did, not pitying, just watching, one hand still pressed against the warm side of a loaf. You eat this morning? Marta said. Seren told her she had. Marta's eyes dropped to the document in her hand and then came back up, and she said nothing else, which was its own kind of sentence. Marta had known Seren's mother, had been at her bedside when she died, had kept her peace in the years since because keeping peace was how you survived in the Ardwell Keep. But sometimes her silence carried everything she was not saying in one long, level look. Seren crossed the yard. She had a message to deliver. The ink did not stay liquid by itself. At the gate to the king's wing, Orlin himself was waiting, which she had not expected. He was a tall man going soft at the middle, with the careful face of someone who had learned to express displeasure through temperature rather than volume. He looked at her wrapped hands, then at the sealed document, then at her face, and said, "The archive rat. Let her through. She is no one the king will remember." This was addressed to the two guards, who stepped aside without expression. Orlin smiled at her then, a performance of warmth. "Deliver it. Wait for his acknowledgement. Return to me. He turned and walked away before she could respond, which was usual. He always walked away before a conversation could become one. The king's hall was larger than it appeared from the outer yard. The ceiling vaulted up into shadow, and the columns along either side were so thick that the torches fixed to them made small warm islands in the cold gray dark. Two attendants stood at the far end near the dais and did not speak to her. She walked to the center of the hall and waited. She had counted 17 steps from the door. She counted things. It was how she oriented herself in spaces that did not belong to her when she heard the door behind the dais open. The air in the room did something then. It did not move, exactly, but it shifted, the way barometric pressure shifts before a storm, a change too subtle to locate and too complete to ignore. She had not expected him to be tall. She had not expected the stillness of him, or the way the attendant simply ceased motion when he entered, as if movement itself deferred. He was wearing a dark coat, high-collared, with a chain of office that had gone unreflective in the low light. There was a scar along his jaw that started just below his left ear. His eyes were light, the color of ice over deep water, and they were on her in the moment he cleared the doorway, steady and immediate. And she told herself later that the shock she felt was simple fear. The reasonable fear of being in the presence of the most powerful man in the North, and being, herself, a girl without a name on the rolls. She told herself that. She believed it then. She delivered the document. She read the words of Orlen's communique aloud the way she had been instructed, steady-voiced, because steadiness was a skill she had, and she applied it universally. The steward had prepared the message to be spoken as well as written, a formal declaration requiring no interpretation. She spoke the words. The bond sense had gone fully quiet. Whatever had remained of the connection to the late Lady Lisa was now gone. The pack should not expect a mate claim from the king in this lifetime. For the good of succession, the king should consider a political alliance of the traditional variety. She said all of this in the precise, measured tone she used for reading records aloud in the archive, and she watched him receive it, and what she saw on his face was not grief. It was recognition, not of the words, something beneath the words, something in the room. She finished speaking. She said, "The steward awaits your acknowledgement, my lord." She began to turn. His hand closed around her wrist. He had crossed the distance between them so fast she had not tracked it. She was simply turning, and then his hand was there. Not rough, not gripping with force, but firm and certain, and the contact struck through her like a key in a very old lock. Something inside her lurched toward the sensation, some animal part of her that had been asleep for so long she had stopped noticing its silence, and it did not simply wake, it roared. She went still. He went very still. His hand did not move. She could feel the warmth of him across the 3 inches between their bodies, could feel it the way you feel a hearth fire from across a cold room, and her mind was doing its best to construct a rational explanation. He had stopped her for a question. He was going to ask about Orlen. She was about to be asked something ordinary, and this would resolve into something ordinary. But her body was not accepting the explanation. Her body was doing something she had no word for. "What is your name?" he said. Not a question, a careful locating of coordinates. "Seren," she said. "The archive. I am the archivist's assistant." "My lord. I am no one of consequence." That last sentence was true in every way the pack acknowledged truth, and she said it as a fact, not a plea. He looked at her as if she had said something he needed to sit with. His hand did not release her wrist. "Who sent you?" he said. "Steward Orlen." "My lord. It is his habit to use me for sensitive correspondences. I am considered." She stopped. She had been about to say, discardable, and caught herself, because even she had some limits. "I am considered reliable," she finished, which was also true, in the same way that a stone wall is reliable, because nothing requires it to be anything else. He let go of her wrist. The absence of his hand was immediate, cold, specific. She did not move for a moment. Neither did he. Then he turned away and said, to no one she could see, "Quand? Keep her here." A voice from the shadow near the dais, she had not known anyone was standing there, answered, "Yes, my lord." If you want to know why she stayed when she might have run, you would first have to understand that she had nowhere to run to. She had no pack name, no family claim, no allied territory. The world outside the Ardwell Keep was winter, and she had an ink-heated palm and cloth-wrapped hands and no coat thick enough for the passes. She stayed because she had nowhere else to be. She told herself that, and it was partly true. It was mostly true. It was not entirely true. Khan was a solid man with an unreadable face who offered her food and did not make her feel watched, which in her experience was unusual in guards. He brought her to a small waiting room near the king's study, lit with 2 wall sconces, and said the king would speak with her shortly, and she sat on the bench provided and unwrapped her hands and looked at them. The cloth came away with the usual faint gray residue from Orland's documents. The parchment he used was treated with something. She had always assumed it was a preservative. She had handled hundreds of his letters in 2 years, and the residue was simply a texture she had stopped noticing. She rubbed her palms together and waited. She waited for nearly an hour. When the summons came, it was Khan again, quiet at the door, and she followed him into the king's study. It was a plain room. 1 desk, 1 window overlooking the inner ward, a wall of shelves with books she noted automatically. She always noted books. A single brazier against the far wall. He was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered, and he did not turn immediately, and she had the unsettling sensation of being examined through the window's reflection. "The bond sense has not gone quiet," he said to the window. She did not know what to say to this. It contradicted the message she had delivered. "What Orland's letter says is not what I feel," he said, and turned. The afternoon light from the window was cold and flat, and it put the scar along his jaw in sharp relief. "For 3 years I have felt nothing where my wolf should be reaching. For the last 20 minutes I have felt it reach." He looked at her steadily. "Toward you." She heard the words. She sorted them into sense. Then she said, "I am not bonded, my lord. I am wolfless." Orland's message. I only carried what I was given. I have no wolf to speak of, and I have never felt a bond sense. The message I delivered is the message as I received it. "You are cold," he said. "Your hands." He had crossed to the desk, and she realized she was still turning her palms over, an unconscious motion, the rubbing together she had done in the waiting room. "What is on your hands?" "The residue from the steward's papers. I handle his correspondence. The parchment he uses." She stopped, because something had changed in his face. Not much. A small shift, the kind that requires stillness to notice. "How long?" he said. "How long have you been handling his correspondence?" 2 years, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." And she sat, because the instruction was complete, and she was an archivist and she trusted instructions. He did not sit. He stood at the corner of the desk and looked at her hands, and something was working behind his eyes that she could not read. The warmth from the brazier reached her across the room. She was aware of it the way she had been aware of his warmth in the hall, as if it were directional, as if it were specifically for her. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop the rubbing motion and looked at the middle distance. "What do you know of ash root?" he said. She knew it as a compound, used in archive conservation sometimes, to fix pigment, though it had largely been replaced by safer preparations. Used in medicine in small quantities, there was a tradition of its use in disputed bond cases, in the old texts. a way of quieting the wolf's signal during ceremonial delays. She told him this. She told him she had read it in the older records, the ones no one else bothered with because the script was archaic and the organizational system was a century out of date. But she had transcribed portions because she found the old system elegant. She told him all of this in the same tone she used for the morning's message, because that was the only tone she had when she did not know what was happening. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "In large doses, in sustained contact, over years. What does it do?" She understood then what he was asking. She understood it the way you understand a record once you find the matching record on the shelf below it. The context clicks, and the page makes a different kind of sense. She said, very carefully, "In sustained contact over a long exposure, it would suppress bond sense entirely. In the party exposed, both parties, if both were in contact with a treated surface." She paused. "My lord, Orlan's parchment." "His parchment," Devon said. "And my water jug. We will find, if Khan's search turns up what I think it will turn up." She sat with that for a moment. She sat with the idea that she had been carrying something in her skin for 2 years without knowing it, that the quiet that had lived in her since she could remember, the flatness where she had assumed a wolf would be, the absence she had attributed to her own low birth and low standing, might not have been absence at all. It might have been suppression. It might have been silence that was not silence. "There are records," she said, "in the old archive. I have never translated them in full, but there are records of bond transfer. When a promised mate dies before a claiming is complete, if the bloodline connection exists through a secondary line." She stopped. She was thinking aloud, and she had not been asked to think aloud. "Forgive me. I am overreaching." "You are not," he said. "Finish it." She finished it. She told him what the old texts described, that a bond could not die if the claiming was never complete, only migrate along the nearest blood connection that carried the genetic signal the wolf recognized. She told him she did not know who Lisa's nearest blood connection was. She told him she did not know why any of this was relevant to her specifically, because she was no one of consequence, and had no family connections to the Eastern line. She told him this last part with her hands flat on her thighs and her voice steady, and he looked at her for a long time after she was done. "Elder Rona," he said at last. "Do you know her?" Seren did. Everyone who touched the old records knew Elder Rona, who was 90 years old and kept the Moonright histories in a cottage near the outer wall, and did not suffer anyone who came without a specific question. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow, you will come with me." He said it the way he said everything, as a fact about the near future, not a request. She nodded and stood, and she was nearly at the door when he said her name. Just her name. She turned. He was still standing at the corner of the desk, and the light from the window had shifted and was behind him now, and he looked for a moment, less like a king and more like a man who had been very cold for a long time and had just felt the first warmth. "You should wash your hands," he said, "thoroughly. Soap and water and then again. Tonight." It was such a specific instruction that she nearly asked why. Then she understood. She said, "Yes, my lord," and left. She washed her hands that night until they were raw. She did not understand, yet, what she was washing away. She understood that the quiet in her might not be the whole truth. She understood that Devon Ardwell had watched her with the kind of attention that had weight, that arrived before the mind could name it and stayed after the words were gone. She understood that she was afraid, and that the fear was not of him, which should have told her something, and which she did not allow to tell her anything yet, because she had an archivist's patience, and she had learned very early not to draw conclusions from incomplete data. Orlan knew by morning. She did not know how. His runners moved like water through the keep's cracks, and she had long since stopped being surprised by what the steward knew and when. She was carrying her water jug from the kitchen cistern when his shadow fell across the corridor, and she stopped walking, because she had learned that stopping was safer than continuing when Orlin was in a doorway. "The king has taken an interest in you," Orlin said. His voice was pleasant. His face was pleasant. "That is unusual. Archivists rarely merit the king's attention. I wonder what you discussed." She said they had discussed the records she kept for the steward's office. He looked at her hands. She had wrapped them again, as habit, though she had scrubbed them raw the night before. "Of course," he said. "How useful you are." He smiled and stepped aside and let her pass, and she felt his gaze on the back of her neck the whole length of the corridor. That morning, Lady Veth stopped her in the hall near the tapestry room, a narrow woman in green wool, with the specific expression of someone who has decided to deliver a small cruelty in the name of caution. "That is the poisoner's daughter," she said to the woman beside her, loudly enough that it was clearly meant to carry. "Why is she still inside these walls?" Seren did not stop walking. She had heard variations of this her entire adult life, and she had made a practice of treating them as weather, present, uncomfortable, not something she could alter by paying it attention. She thought about it on the way to the study, and then tried to stop thinking about it, and found she could not, because for the first time the sentence had a different texture. Her mother was called a poisoner, and Orlin's papers had been treated with ash root for at least 2 years, and her mother had died 6 years ago, and the disgrace had been delivered by the old Alpha on the basis of Orlin's report. She was still carrying this thought, unsettled, not yet settled into a conclusion, when Cain met her at the study door and said the king was ready, and took her to Elder Rona. Elder Rona's cottage was the oldest structure in the keep complex, built against the outer wall so long ago that the stones had settled into each other like old companions. The old woman was at her fire when they arrived, and she looked at Seren for a long time before she looked at Devan, which was unusual enough that Khan noticed it and went still. "I know who she looks like," Rona said. "I have been wondering if anyone else would notice." She stood with some effort and went to her shelves, floor to ceiling, the books there as old as anything Seren had ever seen, and she had seen very old books. She pulled one down, a slim volume bound in dark leather, and held it out, not to Devan, but to Seren. "Can you read the Coastal Eastern script?" she said. Seren said she could. Rona said, "Then read from the third column, the entry for the Ardwell Bond Histories, year 260. Seren read. She read about the mechanics of blood-close transfer, the conditions under which an incomplete mate bond migrated rather than dissolved, the bloodline requirements for transfer to hold. She read 2 pages of this before she reached the marginalia someone had added in a different hand, a name, a date, a notation that the Eastern Lord's second family had been registered in the coastal records, but never in the pack rolls at Ardwell, because the second wife had fled north after the Lord's death and registered her daughter under a different name for the child's protection. The second wife's name. Seren read it twice. Then she looked up. Marta had known, had kept it because keeping it protected the girl, because a name on the Eastern rolls made Seren a target for anyone trying to suppress the bond's rightful heir. Marta had sheltered her in the only way available to an old cook in a keep where the steward controlled information, by keeping her fed and useful, by never saying the thing that would put her more firmly in Orlin's sights. Seren sat with this for a moment and felt something shift in her chest. "The Lisa of the Eastern Lord," she said finally, to Elder Rona. "She was my half-sister." "Yes," said Rona. "And when she died? The bond went to you, the only living blood close with the wolf signal. You have been carrying it for 2 years, muffled by whatever you were absorbing through Orlin's treated papers." The old woman looked at Devan. "And he has been muffled by whatever Orlin put in the water. Take away the ash root and it will be very loud." She did not know what to do with this. She sat with the slim book on her knees and thought about 2 years of handling Orland's correspondence. 2 years of the quiet in her that she had attributed to her own inadequacy. 2 years of Devon Ardwell grieving a bond he had never felt clearly because someone had made certain he would not feel it. She thought about her mother's death, about Orland's report, about what it served for Orland to have a poisoner's daughter as his errand girl, someone who could be accused of anything at any time, whose word would count for nothing against his. She thought about it plainly. If you want to keep a person usable and silent, take away their name. Take away their name and their mother and their clean hands. And then they will carry your poisoned letters for you because they have no other choice. That was the afternoon. By evening, things had moved. Orland moved faster than she had expected. She had understood, in an abstract way, that she was a problem he would need to manage, but she had underestimated how quickly he calculated that managing her meant removing her before the ash root cleared her system and before Elder Rona's testimony could be formalized. She was in the archive corridor when his men came, 4 of them. She had time to recognize what was happening and to plant her feet and refuse to move under her own power, which meant they carried her, which left her hands free, though not free enough to matter. They took her to the lower cells, the old ones carved into the bedrock below the east wing, and they put her in one and locked the iron door, and Orland came to the door and looked at her through the bars with the face of someone completing an administrative task. "She is what her mother was," he said, to the guard beside him. Not to her. Never to her. She had never existed as a person in his accounting. A carrier of harm dressed as a servant. The council will hear it in the morning. She has been handling the king's correspondence, and the king has been unwell. His voice was precise. It was the voice of someone who had thought about this for some time. The archive rat has been slowly poisoning the king through his documents, just as her mother poisoned the litter. Hereditary habit. He looked at her once, directly, the only time he had ever looked at her, as though she existed. "You should have stayed in the archive," he said. Then he walked away. She sat in the dark of the lower cell and thought, with deliberate care, about what she knew and what could be proven. The ash root on his parchment, the treated water, Rona's records, her own bloodline, Lord Fenn, in the keep for the Winter Council, who had known about the second family since he was young but had kept it because his father asked it. She turned each fact like a coin in her palm, and she was afraid. And she let herself be afraid for exactly as long as it took to name the fear. And then she kept thinking. She thought about Devon at the corner of his desk, looking at her as a man feels warmth for the first time in years. She thought about his hand on her wrist in the great hall. She thought about what was coming for him if Orland's plan succeeded. His bond suppressed. His pack run by a steward poisoning him by degrees. She thought that if she had any role to play in what came next, it was not the role of a prisoner waiting to be charged with her mother's crime. She tore a strip from the hem of her underskirt, rough linen, not much, but enough, and used her thumbnail to scratch into the stone wall of the cell. Not words, a symbol. The archive mark for the Ardwell Bond histories. The same symbol that appeared on the spine of Rona's slim book. She did it because she needed to do something with her hands, and because she was an archivist, and because archivists leave marks in the places they have been. She heard him before she saw any light, the sound of the lower corridor, the sound of Khan's voice, and then a silence that was a different quality of silence from all the others. The torch at the end of the passage flared. Then the door. He had come without the chain of office. He was in his traveling coat, dark leather, without ceremony. He crouched down to her level on the other side of the bars, which put his face at her height, and she could see him clearly in the torchlight. His expression was not the remote control she had watched him maintain in the great hall. Something had gone through it, the way a storm goes through a landscape, leaving everything rearranged. "Khan has Orland's documents," he said, The parchment stores. He is burning them. Something moved in the air. She felt it physically, a loosening in her chest, a warmth that spread out through her ribs and into her hands, and she made a sound she had not planned to make, a small, involuntary sound, because it was enormous. That sensation, enormous and sudden and as obvious as a bell struck in a quiet room. His eyes changed. He reached through the bars. His hand closed around hers and the warmth surged. A tidal thing, not romantic in the way stories make romance, but fundamental. The specific recognition of one piece of the world by the piece it had been oriented toward without knowing, and she gripped his hand back and did not let go. "The council is assembled," he said. "All of them. Lord Fen is there. Elder Rona is there. Khan has the samples from my water jug. Your name has been on the coastal eastern rolls since the day your mother registered you. We have the record." He paused. "They will hear all of it. Tonight. Before Orlin can move the trial to morning." She said, "I am afraid." He said, "I know." He did not tell her she should not be. He stayed crouched at her level, her hand in his through the bars, and he pressed his forehead briefly against hers through the cold iron, and she felt his breath and the warmth of his skin and the bond between them. No longer a muffled signal, but a full fact, present as stone and as permanent. She was afraid, and she was also, for the first time in 6 years, not alone. The distinction was enormous. Khan unlocked the cell. She stood. Devon stood. He offered her his arm, not as ceremony, but as something she was meant to take, and she took it. The great hall held 43 lords and council members when they entered. She had counted the torches from the doorway, 12, which was the full ceremonial lighting, the formation used for claims and judgments, and the most formal declarations of the pack. Orlin was already there, at the center of the floor, with his council beside him, and the expression of someone who had not expected the king to move before morning. Lord Fen was at the back of the assembly, tall, with his sister's coloring in his jaw and eyes, and he watched Seren enter on the king's arm with an expression she could not read. Orlin spoke first, because he was Orlin and he had spent 30 years knowing how to speak first. He made his case with the precise voice of someone who had prepared. The poisoner's daughter, the treated parchment, the king's illness. He named her mother's disgrace and let it sit in the room like an old smell. He was good at this. He had spent decades being good at this. Then Khan spoke. Kayan, who was not given to many words, who had spent the previous 3 hours collecting samples from Devon's water stores and from Orlin's parchment room, who had also spent 20 minutes before that with Elder Rona and had come away with notes in his own hand that he now read in his flat, carrying voice to the full assembly. The ashroot compound found in both, the concentration in the parchment, the concentration in the water. 3 years in the water, 2 years in the parchment that went to the archive girl's hands. Elder Rona's testimony about bond transfer, about the coastal eastern records, about the bloodline connecting Seren to the late Lisa, and through her to the bond that had never broken, only gone silent. Lord Fen crossed the hall without being called. He stood before the assembly and said that his father had 2 daughters, one by his primary wife and one by a woman he had loved and quietly protected in the north. He said their mother had been a healer. He said he had known for 18 years and had kept it as his father asked, to protect the girl, and that he had been watching Seren since she entered on the king's arm because she had their father's eyes. He said this in a plain voice, the voice of someone delivering a fact that had been waiting a long time to be delivered. Orlin's council moved toward the door. Khan's men were already at the door. There is a moment in the history of any great lie when the person who constructed it understands that the scaffolding has gone. It does not fall all at once. It goes quiet, the way a fire goes quiet just before it dies, a last compression before the end. Orlin stood at the center of the hall and understood that the 43 lords and council members he had cultivated over 30 years were now looking at him in a different way, and that Devon Ardwell had his hand at the small of Seren's back, and that the bond light, she could feel it now, gold warm beneath her skin, visible at the juncture of her wrist where the bond seat sometimes lit at full clarity, was visible to anyone looking. Several people were looking. The hall was very quiet. Devon released her arm. He stepped forward, into the center of the hall, and turned to face the assembly. Then he went to one knee. On the stone, before 43 lords, in the full ceremonial torchlight, without the chain of office. The assembly went still. Lord Fenn, watching, went very still. Devon looked up at her from the floor and said, in the carrying voice he used for proclamations, the only voice that reached every corner of this hall without effort. She told me my bond was broken. She was wrong. She was the bond. He paused one breath. Her name is Seren of the Eastern Ardwell line, and she stands as my claimed queen before this assembly and before any authority that supersedes it, and any man who challenges that standing answers to me. The first lord to kneel was Caen, though he was not a lord, just a guard, and it was not a formal kneel but a bent knee and a bowed head, which was what Caen had. Then Lord Fenn, which meant something. Then the assembly, not all at once, but one by one, the way fire takes dry wood, first the ones nearest the evidence, then the ones watching the nearest ones, then the rest, until the hall held 43 bent heads, and Orlin standing alone at the center with no one beside him. His end was not slow. It did not need to be. Caen presented the full accounting of the Ashroot administration, the records Orlin had kept, with his own notation, in a locked box that his runner had tried to move and had not moved fast enough. His nephew's name appeared in those records 3 times, the succession plan that required a mateless, grieving king to die before he could produce an heir. Devon read the last 3 lines aloud to the assembly and said nothing further. The sentence was delivered by the evidence itself, which was a more complete justice than anything Orlin would have accepted from a person who once had no name on the rolls. He was gone from the keep before the snow began again. She stood in the hall for a long time after. She was aware of the lords filing out, of Caen at the edge of her vision, of Lord Fenn crossing to her and saying something about their father's other books that now belonged to her. She was aware of all of this, and also of the bond light at her wrist, warm and unhidden for the first time, no longer something muffled and attributed to her own inadequacy. She had been carrying it for 2 years, through Orlin's cold corridors and his dangerous errands and his contempt, through Lady Veth's whisper and the struck name on the rolls, and every morning she had pressed warmth into an ink jar with her palm, because the cold was very cold and the work did not do itself. She had carried it without knowing what it was. Devon was beside her, not touching, just present. The warmth of him arrived before his voice. "You are cold again," he said. "I am always cold," she said. "I have learned to work around it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but close. He reached out and took her hand. Both her hands, her ink-stained, ash-root-cleared, red from the scrubbing hands, and held them between his, and the warmth moved through her the way it had in the lower corridor, complete and directional, the specific warmth of a thing that knows what it is for. She let herself lean into it. She did not pull back. She looked up at him and found him looking at her with the expression he had worn at the window the first afternoon, but without the constraint now. The full weight of it arrived and ungoverned, and she understood that what she was seeing was a man who had been cold for a very long time coming in from the outside, and that she was the fire he was standing before, and that neither of them was going anywhere. "I need to go to Rona's cottage," she said. "There are 3 pages of the bond record I did not finish reading." He said he would come with her. She said she did not need company for reading. He said he knew. They went anyway. The morning after Orland's expulsion, when the snow had laid a clean layer over the inner ward, and the keep was quiet in the specific way that follows great events, slightly stunned, attentive, not yet sure what the new shape of things would feel like underfoot, Marta was at her kitchen door again. Seren saw her from across the yard, the old woman's hands against a loaf the way they had been 2 days ago, watching. Seren changed course and went to her, and Marta looked at her, at the bond light at her wrist, at the unbandaged hands, at whatever had changed in her bearing, and Marta said nothing at all for a moment. Then she held out the loaf. "You eat this morning?" she said. Seren took the bread. She stood in the cold yard in the new morning, and the warmth of the loaf was in her hands, and somewhere across the keep, Devon was already in correspondence with the Eastern Lords to have her name entered in both sets of records, the coastal and the pack, and Elder Rona was preparing the formal bond seat documentation, and Lord Fen had sent a runner north with word of his father's second daughter found at last. All of that was happening. All of that was already in motion. Marta pressed a candle into her other hand, one of the kitchen tapers, already lit. The doorway at the back of the kitchen was the same doorway Seren had passed through 2 mornings ago, carrying Orland's sealed message before the midday bell, on her way to the King's Hall as a girl without a name on any roll that mattered. She looked at it. She looked at the candle in her hand and the bread and Marta's plain, watching face. Then she crossed through. The corridor on the other side was the same corridor it had always been. The difference was only what she was when she entered it.